The Eagle and the Owl. In the 3rd century BCE, long before Rome had reached the heights of empire and centuries after the glories of Athens had begun to fade, a new wind stirred in the eastern Mediterranean. In Athens, a man named Damonides rose from the ranks of the academies. He was a philosopher by education but a soldier in heart. The old polis had grown quiet, resting on the bones of history and theatre, but Damonides saw the embers of greatness hidden in the stone of the Parthenon. He walked the agora not to debate, but to speak of steel and destiny. Rome, at that same time, stood tall on the Italian peninsula. Victorious over the Samnites and the Etruscans, it looked west to Carthage and east to the glittering cities of Greece. The Senate, filled with grey-robed patricians and war-worn consuls, debated policy, land, and gods. But beyond the marble columns, the legions trained relentlessly, sharpening gladi under the sun. Rumors came, borne on merchant ships from the Ionian Sea. Athens had begun to rouse. There were gatherings on the PNYX. Damonides was forging a confederation, Athens, Rhodes, and even envoys sent to Sparta and Egypt. The Roman merchants laughed at first. Greece was poetry and past. But in Rome's heart, the Senate grew wary. Consul Lucius Marcius Falco, a seasoned commander who had never lost a campaign, was summoned. He stood before the Senate, cloak draped over one shoulder, iron eyes watching his audience. When asked what he would do about Athens, he spoke only once. "Let them come." Within months, the Adriatic darkened with sails. Damonides launched his bold move, crossing into southern Italy with 10,000 hoplites, cavalry from Thessaly, and siege weapons designed by engineers who had studied the works of Archimedes. Tarentum opened its gates to them. The city, Greek in origin, saw the Athenians as liberators. Damonides proclaimed a new Hellenic dawn. Rome answered with steel. Falco marched south with Legio IX and 2 auxiliary cohorts. He made camp near the river Ceres and sent scouts to report the Greek positions. At dawn, the Romans marched, red banners snapping in the wind. The two armies met outside Tarentum. The hoplites formed a perfect wall, shields interlocked, spears bristling outward. Damonides rode along the line on a black Thessalian steed, shouting verses of Homer to steel their nerves. The Romans came in force, attacking the flanks first, then the center. Falco knew the phalanx was rigid. He used his velites, light skirmishers, to throw javelins, probing for weakness. Then came the maniples of heavy infantry, smashing the edges and forcing the Greeks to stretch thin. The battle raged from sunrise to high noon. Damonides was struck in the thigh by a Roman pilum but refused to fall. When his horse died under him, he fought on foot, sword in hand. But by sunset, Tarentum's fields were soaked in blood, and the Greeks broke under pressure. The Romans captured the city and burned its outer districts. Damonides and his remaining forces fled across the sea to Syracuse, still a bastion of Greek strength. Syracuse welcomed the wounded army, but the walls were old, the food stores thin. Still, Damonides had one hope left: Sparta. He sent word south, and after weeks, a Spartan commander arrived with 2,000 elite warriors. His name was Cleisthenes, a man of few words and many scars. He took command of the defense, turning Syracuse into a fortress of discipline and order. Rome laid siege within weeks. Falco, though wounded and coughing from swamp fever, directed the legions to encircle the city. Supplies were cut. The Roman engineers built massive siege towers, but Syracuse fought back with cunning. Greek engineers used fire mirrors to burn ships in the harbor. Counterweight catapults slammed Roman trenches. For 8 long months, the siege dragged on. Inside the city, Damonides grew weaker. His wound festered, and he dictated his thoughts onto scrolls with shaking hands. He believed this was no longer a war for land, but for legacy. He wrote, "Let Rome have their empire of roads and conquest. Athens fights for soul and thought." But desperation took root. Food became scarce. Sickness claimed dozens each day. And then, one night under a new moon, a Rhodian commander betrayed the Greeks. He opened a northern gate in exchange for Roman coin. The legion surged in. The battle inside the walls was swift but brutal. Cleisthenes fell on the steps of the Athena temple, fighting 10 men at once before being run through. Damonides was captured, bloodied but alive. Falco ordered that Damonides be brought before him. In the courtyard of a conquered city, the Roman general looked down at the philosopher soldier. Damonides, kneeling, met his gaze. "You fought well," Falco said. "I fought for something greater than victory," Damonides replied. Falco paused, then gestured for his men to release him. "You will not die today. But you will return to Athens and tell them this: the eagle does not sleep." Damonides was sent back under Roman guard. He never raised a sword again. Instead, he taught, in quiet corners of the Lyceum, about war, power, and pride. His story became one of caution and courage. Rome, victorious, took Syracuse and soon after all of Magna Graecia. The Greek cities of Italy became Roman allies or provinces. The Republic grew stronger, more confident, and turned its eyes to Carthage. But in Athens, in a school nestled beneath the Acropolis, a grey-bearded man once called Damonides told his students, "Power is not always won by swords. Nor is it always lost when cities fall. The mind remembers. The soul remembers. And so does history." And for years to come, the people of Athens would sit among the ruins of columns and remember the time they dared to rise against the eagle. And dared to dream. For though the war was lost and the banners of Athens trampled beneath Roman boots, the dream lingered in alleyways and on windswept hillsides where shepherds still recited Homer to the stars. It echoed in the dim-lit halls of philosophers who gathered in secret, speaking in hushed tones about freedom, about glory, about how once, not so long ago, one city dared to stand against the thunder of Rome. Damonides, broken in body but not in spirit, returned to Athens not as a hero, not as a prisoner, but as something stranger, an echo of an ancient defiance. He did not ask for a laurel. He asked only for a seat beneath the olive trees in the Lyceum. There he taught, not of tactics or phalanxes, but of courage, of vision, of the flame that flickers even in defeat. They came to him, students, exiles, even Roman sympathizers drawn by the magnetism of a man who had looked empire in the eye and lived. He spoke softly now, for the fever had never truly left his lungs. Yet his words carried weight like marble, slow and deliberate. He said, "Rome believes history ends with it. But history is not a sword, it is a river. It does not stop for any empire. Not even theirs." His words spread not through scrolls, but through whispers. Young minds took them to heart. In the hills of Boeotia, farmers who had once marched with Damonides sharpened blades in barns, telling their sons of the stand at Tarentum. In Rhodes, sailors carved owls into their ships, hidden behind Roman crests, symbols not of victory, but of remembrance. The Roman governor of Athens tolerated Damonides, if only because the city was calm. But he kept informants nearby. One day, a senator's son visited from Rome, a curious boy named Marcus Aelius Cato. He sat among Damonides' students and asked, "Why did you fight? You knew Rome was stronger." Damonides looked at him with tired eyes. "Because Rome believes strength is destiny. But destiny must be earned." The boy returned to Rome changed. Years later, he would speak before the Senate, arguing against cruelty in the provinces. He cited the wise Greek as his inspiration. Few understood who he meant. Time passed. The Acropolis weathered another century of wind. New generations were born. Damonides died quietly in his sleep, beneath a cedar roof as the city sang festival hymns in the streets. He was buried not in a hero's tomb, but beneath a fig tree in a garden where he had once lectured. But his name was not forgotten. Even as Rome expanded, as Caesars rose and fell, as marble roads stretched to Gaul and distant Britannia, even then, there were those in the academies and forums who recalled the man who had held a torch in the shadow of an empire. One winter evening, long after Damonides' death, a Roman general stationed in Asia Minor passed through Athens on his way to campaign. His name was Publius Severus, and though young, he had heard stories of the Athenian who once defied Rome. Curious, he walked the Lyceum grounds and found the stone bench where Damonides used to speak. There, carved crudely into the stone, were words etched by a student long ago. To speak truth to power is not treason. To dream freely is not rebellion. To resist, even in defeat, is to be human. The general sat in silence for a while. That night, he wrote to his wife in Rome. Athens lies beneath our banners, but her spirit breathes still. We hold her body, but not her soul. Years turned into centuries. The republic collapsed. Emperors ruled. Temples fell. But the dream carried on. In the shadow of the eagle, the owl never truly died. It flew in the hearts of poets who dared write against tyrants, in the minds of rebels who stood against impossible odds, in the ink of scholars who believed knowledge could outlive armies. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in Athens, when the wind moved through the ruins of the Parthenon and the last light of day touched the stones, the people said they could hear it, the whisper of a voice, not loud or proud, but firm. We dared to dream. And somewhere, the world listened. And somewhere, the world listened. It began slowly, like a seed buried in stone. For years, decades, there was silence. Rome endured. Rome flourished. Its roads bound the known world, its legions enforced order, and its tongue, Latin, spread like a tide over the coasts and hills of every conquered land. But under that tide, in places where stone cracked and roots took hold, the old dream survived. 1,000 miles away, in a dusty town in Hispania, a teacher named Virelius passed on the words of Damonides to a room of village children. He had never seen Athens, but he spoke of it with reverence. When asked why he taught forbidden ideas, freedom of thought, defiance of cruelty, he answered, because no truth dies, even when it is buried. In Gaul, in a forest grove where Druid chants had long been silenced, a Romanized Celt sang an old song, reproposed with new words. They told of an owl that once stared down an eagle. Few understood the meaning, but the rhythm stirred hearts. In Egypt, among scrolls and sand, a woman scholar named Themistra found copies of Damonides' notes, reproductions from a scribe who had once studied under him. She read them by candlelight, tears in her eyes, for she too had seen what empire did to knowledge. She recopied them in Greek and in Latin, and hid them in jars beneath the temple of Thoth. Centuries later, fragments would be discovered and misattributed to long-lost philosophers. But Themistra knew the truth. Even in Rome itself, the dream worked its way into the cracks of the marble city. The son of a senator, restless and thoughtful, copied lines from Damonides into his private journal. If you cannot stop the tide, then teach the world how to swim. He became a magistrate known for compassion, feared not for his authority but for his incorruptibility. He never named his muse, but among his servants, it was said he kept a small clay owl on his desk, Athenian, old, chipped from time and wear. Generations passed. The empires changed. Rome burned. Rome was rebuilt. Christianity spread across its remnants. Then Byzantium, glittering and fragile, rose from the ashes. Then came the darkness, plague, war, forgetfulness. But the dream endured. 1,000 years after Damonides stood before the PNYX, a Florentine thinker named Francesco uncovered an old manuscript wrapped in oilcloth in the back of a ruined monastery. He read it aloud to a gathering of students in the candlelight, unaware that the words were descended from Damonides' last lectures. There are victories which echo only in the bones of the fallen. But the sound carries, even through centuries. Francesco wept, not because the words were sad, but because they were still true. He translated them, annotated them, published them. And so, the Renaissance began. Damonides' name was nearly lost by then. His words were often anonymous, his ideas attributed to Socrates, to Plato, or to anonymous Greek sages. But the spirit of his rebellion, the belief that knowledge and courage outlive power, moved through Da Vinci's ink, through Galileo's defiance, through the ink-stained fingers of every scribe who believed the mind had a right to be free. In time, revolution came. Not just in Greece, where the people would one day rise again and tear down the flags of foreign kings, but in places Damonides could never have imagined. In a distant land called America, rebels whispered of liberty, and in Paris, candles lit the dark before the storm of revolution. In every age where tyranny rose, there was a philosopher, a poet, a general, or a dreamer who echoed the idea that Athens had once stood against Rome, not to win, but to remind the world it could be done. And still, somewhere, beneath the dust and the broken columns of the Acropolis, where tourists now gather and children run between the stones, the wind speaks softly. If you listen, truly listen, you might hear it whisper between the olives and cypress. We dared to dream. And the echo returns, not just from the stones, but from the people. Those who remember. Those who teach. Those who resist. Those who build, knowing the towers may fall, but the blueprints live on. So the owl still flies. Not high. Not in daylight. But in quiet places, under moonlight, where hearts yearn to be free, and where voices, no matter how small, refuse to be silenced. Because though Damonides died, the dream did not. And dreams, once dreamt by enough souls, can become nations. Or revolutions. Or futures. And so it was. And so it will be. And so it was. And so it will be. For dreams do not perish the way stone crumbles or flesh fades. They do not bleed, they do not burn, not fully. A dream, once kindled in the heart of one man and passed to another, grows like a flame in dry grass, slow at first, then swift and wild. Damonides' fire, born of despair and defiance, now smoldered across time itself. In lands where his name was forgotten, his spirit remained. In cities where his speeches were never recorded, his message still found voice. The ages changed their languages, but the truth in his words spoke fluently in every tongue. Centuries passed. In the winter of 1821, deep in the mountains of occupied Greece, a rebel named Marcos Philias read aloud to a group of young fighters huddled near a fire. His fingers traced a page, frayed and stained by blood, a passage copied and recopied over generations. It said only, "To live as a free man in chains is greater than to reign as a king over slaves." They knew not who wrote it, only that it was true. That night, they descended into the valleys below and struck the first blow for Greek independence. It would be a long, bitter fight. But they won. In time, the Greeks threw off centuries of foreign rule. The blue and white flag rose, and with it, the echo of every free man who had ever stood against empire. And in that new Greece, poets searched for old names, old texts. In a forgotten monastery in the Peloponnese, one scholar found mention of Damonides. Just a name, a line in an old war journal, he spoke like thunder before Tarentum. It was enough. The search began again. He was not restored to history in full, not yet, but his image began to take shape in the minds of artists and playwrights. A bronze bust was commissioned, Damonides the orator, eyes carved upward, lips parted as if in mid-speech. It was placed near the Lyceum ruins, where birds now nested and tourists passed without looking. But the few who stopped, who read the small plaque, felt something. As if the stone itself remembered. Elsewhere, in other nations, the dream flickered too. In a bombed-out lecture hall in Warsaw, 1944, as smoke curled through broken windows, a professor finished his final class before being taken by soldiers. He had written one line on the chalkboard before the door burst open. There is no army more dangerous than an idea whose time has come. He went quietly, but his students remembered. They whispered the line to each other in prison camps and carried it with them across decades. One became a playwright. Another, a teacher. Another, a leader. When the wall fell, they painted that same line on the rubble. And in the corner of a new university building, far from Athens, a young professor named Lena Caries included Damonides in her curriculum. Not because he was famous, but because he was true. She asked her students, "What is victory? What is loss?" One girl answered, "Victory is to be remembered for the right reasons." Another said, "Loss is when no one dares to speak after you've gone." Lena nodded, and then told them about the man who stood at Tarentum, who endured the siege of Syracuse, who returned to teach when all was broken. Some students wept. Others said nothing, only scribbled his words in the margins of their notebooks. Across oceans, in South America, A muralist painted a great wall, on one side, the towering image of a Roman eagle, wings spread wide in imperial majesty, on the other, a single owl, wings folded, perched atop a burning scroll. Beneath it, in golden script, was etched a single phrase. The world remembers the conqueror's name. But it follows the dreamer's path. It became a landmark. Protesters gathered there during crackdowns. Flowers were laid after every loss. Children traced the owl with their fingers, not knowing its name, but somehow understanding. And far into the future, when cities hover and voices travel through light, when men no longer wage war with swords but with signals and satellites, still the questions will remain. Can freedom be taught? Can courage be inherited? Can a single man, broken but unyielding, plant a seed strong enough to withstand the storms of history? The answer, whispered in languages that no longer exist, repeated in code and print and song, is always yes. Because Damonides did not win. He did not conquer. He did not become emperor or martyr or legend in the ways statues hope to preserve. But he taught. He dared. He endured. And the dream he carried, quiet, luminous, stubborn, moved from hand to hand, mind to mind, generation to generation. It is here, now. In the voice of a child who asks why. In the eyes of a dissenter who will not look away. In the heartbeat of anyone who stands before power and says, no. Not yet. Not like this. And when the winds rise again, when empires return, cloaked in modern robes, speaking old lies in new tongues, the owl will fly once more. Silent. Steady. Unseen by many.